Okay, hello again. Video number 2. This one is going to be all about an encounter that I call the Miniboss. And the reason I call it the Miniboss is because this is kind of like the most standard D&D encounter ever. The reason I didn't start with this one is because honestly it's a little like too simple and it doesn't really show off the effectiveness of the curves very well. But it does work. It's actually a great proof of concept because it's so simple and because it overlays very, very nicely with a lot of existing things. So you could also call this like the standard if you wanted, but whatever. It's called the Miniboss mainly because this is the kind of thing that you're going to run into a lot. You're going to see a lot of this in D&D. In 5th edition in particular, these curves are sort of what the mechanics are driving forward. So the most important thing to note about this is that it makes a fight feel pretty noteworthy and significant, but it's not going to feel epic because it curves once with a gradual increase and a gradual decrease. So what you end up with is a fight that has a really nice flow, but is really straightforward and doesn't have that feel of like a whole bunch of things happening and you had to overcome all these obstacles to make the fight work out. It's not this kind of fight that you're constantly struggling. It's a very straightforward kind of things are getting a little bit harder and a little bit harder and a little bit harder. Then they peak and then you start to kind of get a handle on the fight and do okay. So one of the best and most obvious ways to do this is just by streaming things in to the fight. And remember to keep things really simple. You don't need to make things super complicated. You don't need to go, oh man, I need to come up with all these crazy custom mechanics to make this work. You don't need to do any of that. In order to make this fight work, really all you need, this is a really simple version of this fight, okay? If you have like a few of an enemy type in a room with your players and your players are fighting them, and then those enemies of the same type or a different type, it doesn't really matter. Although for the purposes of simplicity, we'll use the enemies of the same type. Let's say they're skeletons. So skeletons are like flooding into the room, but just a couple skeletons at a time. And they're coming into the room a little bit faster than the enemies can kill them. So that the number of skeletons in the room is slowly increasing. Now, the nice thing about this and what makes it so simple and straightforward is that the intensity of the fight is going to be pretty much directly proportionate to how many enemies are in the room with the players. Of course, you don't want to go overboard and make it so there's too many so that the players are overwhelmed completely because you want that gradual increase and then a peak and then a gradual decrease. But it's really straightforward because as skeletons come into the room, tension is going to increase and that's going to make the intensity rise as well. Then when players are getting close to half hit points or maybe a little bit below or something in that general range, you peak by stop the flood of enemies into the room. And that makes the intensity peak. And then the players are just getting a handle on the fight, but they're still kind of struggling. But now, as they kill individual skeletons, the intensity is going to decrease gradually because it gets less and less dangerous the fewer skeletons there are. Really straightforward, really easy. You don't need to make it that complicated. Now, you can do way more stuff with this. Obviously, you can do way more with this. And we're going to go through a couple of examples of that in a minute. But that's a really straightforward version of that fight, and I like to give that example because it's really clear, I think, when you hear that example, how the curve is supposed to play out and how it maps exactly to the mechanics. So, some ways to make this curve work. First, you need to start at a low point of intensity. That's really important because you want to build that intensity up. We're not starting high. It's not like the surprise. We're starting low and building up gradually. So, here's a few ways that you can do that. You can tell the players what they're fighting and then give them the opportunity to prepare for it. They can go study up on the kinds of things that creature does. The most important thing, though, is that you're starting at a low point of intensity. The reason preparation works so well for that is because players are going to feel pretty confident going into that fight. Now, you need something to make the intensity gradually increase. So you can't make it so that the players know everything about the fight ahead of time. There has to be something that comes out that they weren't prepared for. Of course, you don't want to make it feel cheap, so you don't want it to come out of nowhere. But if they know that the boss has some minions, you can do things like, I called for my reinforcements and now they're on their way and they'll be here next round. And now the intensity starts to increase because anticipation is also intensity. So as that increases, now the little dudes start coming in. And just like with the initial example, you just start flooding dudes in until you don't need to flood dudes in anymore. Then the players start dealing with things. The main guy is starting to get low and the dudes' little minions are starting to dwindle. And they get a handle on the fight and gradual decrease in intensity. And it ends at the lowest point of intensity as well, which creates a really strong sense of resolution. Easy, no problem. Another example is scouts. because what can happen with scouts is there's 2 goblins and the players know exactly what to expect with 2 goblins, and they didn't do any preparation, but they still feel pretty confident because it's just 2 goblins. Even if they're, 3 or 4 level 3 or third or fourth level players, they can deal with 2 goblins no problem. But if they start approaching the goblins and they enter into the fight with the goblins, and one of the goblins runs away because they're going to get reinforcements, same deal. Anticipation and intensity can start to increase, and then they get into a much stronger fight, which can then resolve. Very much unlike the surprise, you want resolution for the mini-boss. You want there to feel like there was a strong conclusion to the fight. And it doesn't have to be epic. It's not epic. This is not the big epic final boss curve. This is a somewhat significant fight. That's it. It's got a nice little 3-act type structure. It increases, rising action, and then the climax, and then the falling action, and the conclusion. That's it. It's one of the reasons it's the most common curve is because it's really straightforward and really simple. You generally don't want to use things like dragons. You generally don't want to use things like beholders. There's a lot of variance in those fights and a lot of spikes in the way that they unfold. Again, we'll go into those kinds of monsters probably at a later date. But there are some useful tools in creatures like that. Legendary actions are a great way to have a gradual increase in the curve, because if a creature can only fight on its turn, if you only have one creature and it's just taking actions on its turn because it doesn't have legendary actions or reactions, then it's really hard to gradually increase the intensity. You can spike the intensity, but the intensity spikes are all going to come on that creature's turn, because that's when it does all the stuff. That's when it starts doing all the damage. That's when it petrifies people or whatever, right? So legendary actions are a great way to do that. Another great way to do this is lair actions. Lair actions also come into play in other curves, so do legendary actions, but keep in mind that you can use like minor legendary actions or minor lair actions to gradually increase the intensity. Generally, you're going to want minor actions here because, again, it's not the big epic fight. So that's it. That's the mini-boss. It's really straightforward. It's really simple. And there's a couple examples of how to do that. If you ever want just a fairly straightforward but significant feeling combat that has a solid resolution, this is the one for you. This is great. This fits great into narrative situations too. If you have, again, it's called the mini-boss. So if you're using a mini-boss or like some big bosses like Lieutenant creature or whatever, this is a great curve for that. So hopefully you can employ this, and even though it's simple, that doesn't mean it's not effective. It's just as effective as any other curve, and it's the easiest one to implement. So if you're struggling, this is the one I actually recommend that you start with, because it's good practice. Next time we're going to go over something a little bit more complicated, and I'm looking forward to that because it's going to be tough. So check out the next video when you can. When it's up, it's going to be great. We're going to go into the big epic boss fight on the next one. So hope this helped. Again, if you use it and it worked for you, let me know how it goes. I'm interested to see how this kind of works out for you. I've been using these kind of curves for a long time, and they've always worked for me, but it's really interesting to see if they work for other people. So that's it. That's it for the mini boss. We're done. I'll see you guys next time. No problem.